Welcome to another FourNet podcast. Today we are talking about QA as the police and why the gotcha culture of QA is the number one driver of agent attrition and why quality assurance should be renamed performance enablement. So first thing I want to talk about today is QA. It has an image problem. So I'll come to you first, Lisa, if I may. How do you think this reputation has formed over time?
I think it's a perception, isn't it? I don't think it's necessarily, is QA wrong, because I think there is an absolute place for it. But I think done badly, what it can do is it can create an us and them culture. And I think this happens in businesses where they are genuinely not putting the customer first. And I think sometimes when we don't explain why we're actually completing quality assurance and customer outcome testing, it's difficult for our agents and advisors to understand. And I think this is where coaching and development and understanding comes in quite a lot. So I think it's more a perception thing, really, rather than ban QA. I think there's absolutely a place for it done well.
Interesting. And I think I'll bring you into this bit, Kev, that how much do you think things like, make use of the customer's name or, a certain piece of script hasn't been delivered, with sort of theatrical performance standards, how much of that do you think has contributed to QA being seen as, something that's done to agents rather than with them?
I think, without bypassing the question, I still think some of this sits with governance at the top of it. And who looks after the three lines of defence? Are you marking your own homework? Are you here trying to get to a magical score where, as a result of this, everything looks okay, rather than actually genuinely finding out areas of poor performance, fixing them, which is part of it, and enabling your agents, debt advisors, whatever that may be, so debt advisors, particularly in the case of MoneyPlus, and enable them to perform to the top of their ability. And I think that often when we talked about consumer duty earlier on today, that needs to come through. The assurance piece is, to me, really important. Product design and the whole customer journey. How are you providing assurance to the senior management of the business that everything is going fine? If it isn't, that you focus and fix it. Quality assurance has as much a remit to do that as the people that are actually delivering the service. That loop, feedback loop that we've talked about before, is crucial.
And how do we bring agents into that, Kev? I'll come to you first and then I'll just get Lisa's views.
Yeah, so again, I've got pretty strong views that have occurred through the consumer duty, where we talk about inclusive design, co-design, and that involves actually the end customer. So if you're going to involve the end customer, you should be engaging with the agents and advisors that are delivering the service. So we saw a little bit of this with open banking, and now we've got the open finance vision. Why was it that open banking wasn't embraced? Often it was the agent, not the consumer, that was the problem. They didn't get it. They hadn't been brought along that journey to say this will significantly enhance the journey that you're looking at with somebody. And use of AI adoption and the like is going to be the same thing. If you haven't brought your agents along on the journey, what you may have done is a fabulous job with the consumers and told them about new journeys they've got, and just witnessed buy now, pay later, deferred payment credit. That's consumer driven. But are the people in the journey embracing the fact that we're going to have people that are smartphone enabled, digitally enabled, and there are the agents actually understanding that? And some of that may be aligned to their life experience. If you're populating with high churn with relatively young people with limited life experience, you've got to find a way of imparting that so these quality discussions actually take place.
Interesting. And from your perspective, Lisa, and we've worked together on transformation at MoneyPlus. What other experiences have you had in previous organisations, perhaps, of enabling agents to be part of the QA process?
Yeah, so I think both in MoneyPlus and in other businesses that I've worked in, I think the inclusion of the agents, as Kevin mentioned, is really, really important. I also think it's the why. I think as Kevin alluded to, not everybody has the same level of life experience, and it's understanding how each parts of the communication that we have and the quality assurance journey that we follow, why they're important to the customer and why they're important to the business, and how that ties in with delivering a really good customer outcome. So I think calibration plays a really big part of that. And I also think compliance and quality assurance, they should be, we should work together. First and second line and third line where you have internal audit, they should absolutely work together to support each other. We should be providing also good feedback. So what we shouldn't be seen as is, oh God, compliance are in the room, QA are in the room. We want to be seen to deliver positive outcomes as well as areas for development.
Brilliant. I want to just move us on a little bit from agents to talk about quality assurance professionals. So those people that are doing first, second and third line checks. So how do we move from that QA that we've talked about, where they are seen as the police, they're seen as judge, jury, executioner? How do we move from that to coaching, insight and behavioural uplift through those particular individuals?
So from my perspective, we deliver an awful lot of training before an agent even hits the calls, and part of that training will be with both first and second line. And with second line, we invite them to ask us questions, we invite them to give us feedback, and the rationale of us sitting with them before they are fully live is so that they understand both who compliance are and who first line QA are, so that we can have those open lines of inquiry.
Super. And Kev, from your perspective, I want to just touch on QA rules that feel like they've been written by somebody that's never spoken to a customer. I know you've got some views on that particular point. Yeah,
just reflecting on Lisa's point there, I actually think some of this is a lot easier if people have come from a background of being frontline and then move into QA because they don't want to go up the management level. So there's a different challenge there to somebody who actually wants to be a traffic warden in the first place, and then you've got to actually try and get them to embrace what the consumer duty really means and how you are going to highlight areas where there may be poor outcomes, but then you look at the continuous monitoring, continuous improvement type loop. So there's quite a key job there in terms of how you actually put that into your job description to say, I have a remit here to actually look at fixing this particular problem. So if there isn't a complete loop, and we've seen this with several of the clients we've worked with, where you've got all the tools at your disposal, but how are you going to put that coaching piece into play so your constructive feedback goes into driving better outcomes that everybody can actually understand. Now, one of the other areas that I'm very passionate about is looking at the whole customer journey. So if I just look at an analogy, having recently travelled to Copenhagen to have to do the biometrics, the fingerprint, the retinal scan, as well as putting your passport in, the journey was pretty good until you get into the bit you can't control, which might be the call queue or something else that's happened. So often you're finding people who are on the phone fixing a poor started call or poor journey, and sometimes QA people don't take that into account, don't look at the whole journey in terms of, here are the siloed bits, where did you come from before, was it partially digital, did you then come into an AI assisted role to one where you're actually speaking to the client? That journey's got to be looked at, and I still feel that QA has got to learn and grow where you've got this sort of 100% holistic view rather than this 4 calls per agent and I've done my job and they all scored 85%. The world's moved on from that, and QA's got to evolve from that as well.
I think that's really interesting that the organisations that I've worked with in the past that I'm working with now, they embrace quality assurance and compliance at director level. You know, that comes from the top. We talked about it in terms of the checkboxes, and I think that is really key in terms of engagement, because that then, you know, is a cultural shift. We talked earlier about checkboxes and what that means for consumer duty, and this is broadly the same, in my opinion, that we're talking here about making sure that everybody's bought into quality assurance, that this doesn't just become, you know, somebody that can go around with a clipboard, so to speak, and, you know, give you a slap on the wrist when you know, had done things like haven't said the customer's name. I do want to just talk about, though, how that performance enablement, and I'll just come back to you, Kev, because of what you were talking about there on consumer duty. So in a more direct sense, how do we link consumer duty outcomes back to quality assurance and that culture that I was just talking about there?
So first up, you've got to look at it from the outside in. So looking at internal metrics, average call handling time, wait times, those things, they're important metrics, but they're very introspective. So understanding what somebody's intent is really important, what outcome they want to achieve. So particularly in somebody like MoneyPlus's model, you know, they're there to try and find a solution to their debt problem. They don't know what product they want when they first contact you, and they may want to engage through a variety of channels. So now with the new Money and Pension Service standards just coming into action this month, it's channel agnostic. So QA needs to have that mindset that says these journeys are channel agnostic. You can mix. So the simple bits you might want to do through web chat or through a digital channel, but when you get into the complexity, high emotive bits, you may want to speak to a human being. So therefore the journey needs to be measured very adaptively to take account of, you know, there could be a bit of AI involved in this. It could be doing the speech analytics, the sentiment analytics, and also looking at things like, and you know, for Lisa's area, the tone. You know, and the FCA are all over the fact that that advisor gave the right advice, you ticked all the boxes. But when you mentioned IVA, a big sigh. When you mentioned debt management plan, you know, their eyes lit up, and, you know, and so there's an, you know, inference there, that's the solution for you. So all of those things need to be taken into account in terms of that a whole customer journey. And I think particularly now when you're looking at consumer understanding, which is the new mega topic, how are you doing that at each point in the journey? And if you're over scripted, you're not going to do this. So if you've already determined that somebody's got the reading age of 11, how are you asking your agent to adapt without actually speaking very slowly, or, you know, where English is not first language, putting a French accent on? You know, we're not talking about that anymore. We're talking about tools that enable better customer journeys, and that the agent is empowered to use those tools. And I would actually say, if the agent is actually resisting change, and I saw this at HMRC where it was like beat the robot. So you had something doing all the work in the background to look across, you know, 16 heads of duty systems, but the agent was still trying to beat it manually. You know, those are things now that we should be looking at from a QA perspective that says this is not encouraging the right behaviour. We need to be looking at how you best use the tools, all the agent assist that you built in. And interestingly, in the sector we're talking about here, where I'm a director, things like large language models are now being built and sponsored by the Money and Pension Service to make sure that the agent has got the right repository of data. They make sure they source it from the right place, and that should enable a rookie to be able to actually reference where they've got the information from, to build trust and confidence in the consumer. So QA's got to be sympathetic to that said, these tools are running in the background, are they making best use of them?
I actually think sorry, I was just going to say, I actually think, to Kevin's point, I actually think it's a step back further than that. So in addition to QA, all our advisors undertake an awful lot of training to understand how to speak to our customers. By their very nature, customers contacting us are in difficult situations. We deal with a lot of vulnerable customers, arguably all of them are vulnerable. And it's making sure that our teams understand how to have that level of communication, but also that when we're conducting quality assurance, that we know we don't want to understand necessarily just has the process been followed. We want to understand, did that customer understand? Could we evidence that the customer could understand? Were there any areas of confusion, or where the customer indicated that they weren't quite sure? And we spend a lot of time on that, making sure that we feed back and that we coach, so that our advisors give the right information and the QA delivers the right outcome. So understand, etc.
And you both touched on this separately. I think, Lisa, from your perspective, because you touched on it first, that sort of collaborative calibration, where does that sit in terms of engaging everybody and that understanding of what's expected on a call versus the checkboxes or somebody coming and QAing it? Where does that collaboration and that where does that sit really within that process?
So the collaboration is usually completed first line with advisors. However, what compliance do to make sure that we have continued collaboration with first line is make sure that we collaborate with them and we understand and calibrate calls, particularly if we're experiencing maybe a shift, for example, in DPA. Say our advisors are not asking the right DPA questions or forgetting or whatever. I think it's really important to calibrate, to understand feedback, but also to understand why things are happening. And what we've done as a result of some calibration historically is we found that some of our advisors were missing part of a script. It didn't happen a lot, but it did happen nonetheless. And it meant that because of working with them, we actually changed we changed the system so that it was easier for them to follow, because we weren't giving them the right tools to operate. And following that, we saw a real shift. They then felt empowered to feed back to us, because the change was positive. It made their lives easier. It gave our customers a great outcome. So yeah, it's collaboration at all levels really. So it has to be first line and advisors and team leaders. That everybody has to be involved in it really. And I know from the top, literally from a director exco level, we've listened to calls. And it was part of our regular exco to listen to those calls and understand the type of conversations that our advisors were having. I think that's a gap sometimes.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I just wanted to bring us to a piece on, I was coming back to our friend Consumer Duty, that, facilitating those good outcomes for customers. How much do we feel that that's improved when our agents are fully engaged, when they have the right information to enable performance? What kind of impact do you think that has, Lisa, on overall outcomes?
It can be transformational. I think if an agent understands the why, if they have the right tools in order to deliver, there are circumstances where we've historically been really heavy scripted, but we understand because of the nature of some of our customers, the scripts don't always follow. So you will never be penalised if you're dealing with a particularly vulnerable customer for going off script. We expect you to have those different conversations in order to provide the right support for our customers.
I think, Lisa, in terms of some of the tools you've used, particularly around some of the conversational AI, it's actually going to that next step where you can have a bloke in a pub speaking Conning Rhining slang, and that you're adhering it to what they want to say, and then the onus is on you guys to then interpret that and feed that in with some structure into things like an income and expenditure format without the client ever knowing what the standard financial statement is.
Absolutely. It's the way you ask the questions, isn't it? I've seen some really detailed and complicated INEs, and it's our job to break that down for our customers in a really understandable level. That's not an easy job to do. So it's really important that we give our advisors the tools to do that in the right way.
And the controversial question, Kev, that we've talked about scripting. We know the great work that MoneyPlus are doing in terms of moving away from that. But how much of that culture of having things scripted comes from, I don't want to fail my consumer duty outcomes, I don't want the FCA to see me not doing these things. Do you think that there's been pressure on firms to put that scripting in because they're afraid to fail?
So I'm going to say something controversial here, as you probably might expect me to. Consumer duty was brought in the sector we're talking about here, which is the debt management space. And on the one hand, we've got a rule book that was written in April 2014, and it was a carryover from the Office of Fair Trading. It hasn't been updated in 12 years. And on the right, you've got a principle-based, outcome-focused regime coming in. And our source book doesn't mention the vulnerability guidance. It doesn't mention AI. It doesn't mention digital transformation. So Lisa's faced with the challenge that says, right, I've got an out-of-date source book that I've got to interpret that is rules-based, and I've got a principle-based regime over here. Somewhere between the two, they fit together. Debt collection in November 24 had a complete facelift. Yeah, so the Conc 7 book, which is their source book, references the consumer duty, mentions the vulnerability guidance, mentions open banking, mentions data sharing. So there's still this legacy there that's there between two regimes. And on top of that, Lisa's team have also got to deal with two regulators in debt solutions. So you've got, insolvency regulator and you've got debt advice regulator. So all of those require interpretation from the top that says, here's the right balance. These bits are still open to interpretation. We will set out how we've interpreted the rules and the guidance, but we've got to be very mindful of the outcomes we're delivering to our consumers. And that is going to be very much risk appetite driven. And so in the sector there, MoneyPlus Group were asked questions by the regulator as a commercial firm. Why is it that nobody knows about Money Helper or Step Change? Well, why is that your problem? When that should be somebody else doing that awareness campaign. Nonetheless, what we've seen is major changes from the firms in the sector now going the extra mile to actually find out why is it a consumer doesn't know about something you think is obvious, which is there is, these support organisations out there. What is it that the money advice, service should be doing? What should Step Change? And the fact that there is low awareness, firms are now taking that on board. But it is a challenge for QA because you've got to then get the agents, which on face value looks like you're redirecting somebody to the local car dealership instead of yours, to make sure that's embraced, and that you do some of this consumer understanding piece that said, I'm dealing with somebody here who has very low awareness of anything in this versus somebody who's doing their second debt advice solution who ought to know better. And by the way, the 7 creditors involved have all sent umpteen pre-arrears and default notices which said, here are the firms you should be speaking to, starting with Money Helper. So there is a lot of go the extra mile element here, that when you look at it, a lot of this is very much culture and governance, and as Lisa said, what do we want to do to actually fix some of these challenges, at least in the areas that we can touch and influence?
And just to round off that point, Kev, in terms of all of that different guidance, legislation, regulation that we've got, that QA teams are faced with, is there any wonder why they feel like they are the police, or they feel like they've got to be like the police because there are so many things that they have to satisfy? Do you think that is part of the problem?
I think it is, but I don't think it's the predominant piece. I think if we look in today's agile world and we talk about a sprint type process, QA needs to be involved in that. If we're looking about a constant improvement, so Lisa at the moment will be looking to her duty report in July, which will be looking at continuous improvement. But within that, the biggest thing you've got to sign off once a year is your product assurance framework. And that looks at all the touch points around product design, fair value, consumer support, and consumer understanding. QA needs to be involved in that. So when you review that holistic, what does my DMP look like? Is it vanilla or is it Neapolitan? And in lots of products, if you turn around and say, I'm going to be the cheapest, what gives if you're going to be the cheapest but still meeting the requirements, versus I'm going to be a premium product provider, and this is all the extra support you get with that, which includes things which are very topical at the moment following the Panorama programme, people's obsession with their credit score. You're now having to go off-piste and explain this is what will happen based upon where you are individually. So QA, this is a big challenge for QA. If Lisa's team beforehand turned around and said, right, all I want to make sure is you say, if you're going to go into this debt solution, this will happen to your credit file. That's not good enough anymore. It's, I've had a look at you where you are, Mr. X, in your journey, and as a result of that, this is likely to be the effect based upon the creditors that you've got in your remedy. So it's much more tailored. And big data, when you talk about the big brother, the FCA have now got the big data. I think it's the 28th, Lisa, you hand over all of your information for 2025.
That's
Every
right,
firm in our sector has to do that on the same day. So there's no hiding place. It's based around your year end. It all comes in together, and the FCA will definitely be looking at it from a sector perspective and then overlaying that with what the creditors had to provide last November and then quarterly afterwards. So there's not really any hiding place when it comes to a data-driven approach. The FCA have been clear. They've got the big data. You haven't. So make sure you know what's going on and you do some benchmarking and know where you sit within your peer group.
And just coming back to you, Lisa, on some of those points earlier about the amount of scrutiny that you're under. How does that feel culturally, for you, living, breathing that day in, day out? How do you then make your quality assurance more geared towards performance enablement while making sure all those boxes are ticked?
Yeah, so should we have a level of scrutiny? Absolutely. We're giving important advice at a really difficult time of a person's life. And in terms of the scrutiny that we're under, it feels appropriate. What was the second part of the question? Apologies.
Just how you're living and breathing that change to performance enablement while dealing with that level of scrutiny.
Yeah, so it's a journey, as they say, to improve the process and to improve. And we've gone on that process quite recently, and more so, as you're aware of, with the integration of AI, etc. What we're really keen to do is, in addition to improving through feedback, is also to deliver really positive feedback. Something which I've not seen done in a lot of businesses. Compliance and first line are usually seen as, the business prevention police. That's absolutely not the case. But we've also had people. There's an element of psychological safety as well. I think if somebody has spoken to a customer and they're not quite sure if they've said what they should have done, it's them actually coming to our first line saying, just listen to this call for me, I'm just not quite sure. And it's been more collaborative. We're not going to resolve this overnight. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, but the principle is doing the right thing for our customers. However you apply that from an advisor right up to the board, we want to make sure that the service that we provide and the information we provide is clear. We work to a reading age of 11. That's included in all our documentation, in the way we speak to our customers, in the way we communicate. So we're very, very clear about that right throughout the journey.
Fantastic. And I absolutely love the idea that the go-to place will be that agents listen or deliver a call and then go and seek advice because, did I do this right? That's a massive cultural shift from, where we've been, certainly in the past in many organisations, but absolutely what needs to happen to ensure good outcomes, customer understanding, all of those great things that we've talked about. I will just come to you both for final thoughts, if I may. So, Kev, I'll come to you first. So if you had carte blanche to scrap one QA rule forever because it doesn't add any customer value or add value to the agent, what would that be?
Well, first of all, I'm just going to follow up on the last point.
Yeah, sure.
Part of this dimension is also looking at performance management in the terms of what the agent and QA incentives are. So the FCA are very focused on outcomes, but also is there a commercial bias to that? So that's quite important when we look at this particular point. So my Room 101 type thing is being overscripted. I think in the world we're in at the moment, we need to enable the agents to go slightly off-piste to have quality discussions. And as a result of that, you should be focusing on what the call intent was and what the outcome. So when you're recording the wrap at the end of it, it's reflective of why somebody called you in the first place. So overscripting, I think, has gone to the point where people are reverting almost back to tick box.
Wonderful.
I agree. I completely agree with that. And as I said in my earlier comments, you will never be scored down for going off piste, as you describe it, Kev. When we have a conversation with a vulnerable customer, if it takes longer, if we have to use different language, if we have to break the calls down, whatever, that will never be scored down.
And just a final question to you, Lisa, if I may. So biggest misconception QA teams have about their own role in the organisation, what would you think that is as it stands at the moment?
I don't think it's necessarily their misconception, because I haven't really had this. It's to help them understand how they enable the business to continue to develop and keep our customers safe, but also develop our teams and our processes as well. It's not an easy job, but it's also about celebrating the wins as well.
I think on just one point on that, and I think we've looked at this, Tracey, for firms that have moved from near real time to real time, QA's got a different role to play, which is putting the client in the right place if something is going wrong. Don't wait a week for that to happen. That real-time engagement becomes important, but it puts a different perspective on first and second line. If something's gone wrong, fix it as quickly as possible, address the agent or advisor shortcomings after that, but put the client first in that if you've got the tools to do it. And I think increasingly we're seeing people who've got the tools, but they're not necessarily using them. That can be a bit of a heinous crime if you turn around and say, I've got a Rolls Royce over there, but you're only using the Ford Fiesta elements of it. So that would be one of the big areas there. Are you making the most of the tooling?
Completely agree.
And
go on, go ahead, Lisa.
Sorry, I was just going to say, and it's kind of having the Bentley without the fuel, isn't it, really? Because if you have the opportunity to put a situation right and you don't do it, it's kind of, so what? What's the point of completing QA if you're not putting the customer back in the situation they should be?
And then just as a final thought from me, Kev mentioned it there, we're working together currently, Lisa, we've got the Rolls Royce or the Aston Martin or whatever car that we want to talk about. And that is transforming quality assurance. And then what I find as I've worked with organisations is that level of feedback that is so recent. If it's not real time, it's near real time. It's within, a day, less than a day, a couple of hours of the call. Getting that feedback back to agents really enables and empowers them to move to that performance enablement model, not the old quality assurance. So thank you both. That's been great. Thank you for joining us, Lisa, and thanks always to Kev.